For the last time, Josef Fritzl took the long walk to court. A dozen policemen guarding a man who's received thousands of death threats. He looked every inch someone ready to finally face judgment. This is the face of a man who's been broken. After the cameras had left, his lawyer told the jury it was the presence of his daughter Elisabeth in court this week that made him change his pleas. Fritzl himself then addressed the jury. "I'm sorry from the bottom of my heart," he said. "Unfortunately, I can't change anything now."
It began quietly, the way most life and death moments do. Inside Amstetten General Hospital, a young woman lay on a gurney, unresponsive. Her skin looked almost translucent, the kind of pale that suggested she hadn't seen sunlight in a very long time. Faint blue veins traced her arms, and an oral exam showed severe dental deterioration. She appeared extremely frail, her age hard to place. Standing beside her was an elderly man, gray-haired and trembling slightly, his clothes neat, his expression unreadable. He told the staff her name was Kirsten. He said she was his granddaughter. A nurse leaned in to whisper, almost under her breath, "She's 19, but she looks 50. The doctors searched for her medical file, but there was nothing, no school records, no vaccination history, and no trace that this young woman had ever existed. When they asked the old man for the mother's contact information, he paused too long. His eyes darted between the doctors. His story shifted. Once, then again. First he said the mother was traveling, then he said she'd joined a religious group somewhere far away. The staff exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't know who this man really was, or where the girl had come from, but something about the way he stood there, quiet, rehearsed, almost waiting, set off every alarm in the room. What they didn't realize was that they weren't treating an ordinary patient. And the man standing beside her wasn't just a grandfather. He was the keeper of one of the darkest secrets Austria had ever known. In April 2008, that single hospital visit would uncover a hidden world, an underground prison, a family trapped in silence, and a truth that had been buried beneath the same house for 24 years. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935 in the small Austrian town of Amstetten, a place that would one day become synonymous with horror. His parents, Maria Fritzl, née Nenning, and Josef Fritzl Sr., were not a loving couple. His father was a violent alcoholic who often vanished for days, and when he did return, it was usually in a rage. He would shout, drink, and strike Maria without hesitation, and by the time little Joseph was 4 years old, his father had abandoned them completely. Maria raised her son alone, but her parenting carried the scars of a harsh, war-torn Europe. She was rigid, cold, and unforgiving. When Joseph misbehaved, which for a boy his age could mean almost anything, she would tie him to his bed or send him outside barefoot, forcing him to sleep in the yard as punishment. She hit him with her fists, her boots, or whatever she could find nearby, and the neighbors learned not to interfere. They would later describe Maria as a woman made of stone. Then came the war. Amstetten, unfortunately positioned between Germany and Italy, became a regular target for Allied bombers. Nights were filled with the low rumble of aircraft and the fear of not waking up. Food was scarce, and life revolved around surviving each day. Joseph grew up surrounded by rubble and silence, and even at a young age, he learned that control was power. That if he could not control his surroundings, he could at least control himself. After the war, Soviet forces occupied Amstetten, and the town became a dangerous place for women and children. Violence and assaults were common, and Joseph watched his mother grow even harder, even more punishing. She told him often that men were weak, that love made people foolish, and that he would need to be strong to survive. So he obeyed her. He learned to fix things around the house, spending hours taking apart radios and appliances and putting them back together. People began calling him the boy who could repair anything. And in that mechanical precision, he found something that made sense: order, predictability, control. But beneath that discipline, something darker was forming. By 16, Josef had begun lurking near parks and alleyways, watching women from a distance. One evening, unable to contain whatever was stirring inside him, he leapt from the bushes and exposed himself to a passing woman. She screamed and he ran. No charges were filed, but it was the first recorded sign of a pattern that would never end. After high school, Josef moved to the nearby city of Linz, taking night classes in electrical and mechanical engineering. He worked days in a metal fabrication plant and spent his evenings studying, driven by a need to appear respectable, to rise above his upbringing. Those who met him described him as polite and serious, not warm, not friendly, just efficient. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. By 1956, at 21, Josef attended a social gathering where he met Rosemarie Bayer, a quiet 17-year-old with soft features and modest ambitions. She came from a conservative family, devoted to routine and religion, qualities that appealed to Josef. She was gentle, unassuming, and eager to please. Their courtship was brief, but for Josef, it was enough. She wanted a husband who would provide stability, and he wanted someone who would never challenge his authority. They married that same year. People who knew them later would say their marriage looked ordinary from the outside, the picture of mid-century Austrian domestic life. But behind closed doors, Josef's obsession with control was growing. He liked schedules, he liked silence, and he liked to be obeyed. He liked rules, he liked control, he liked silence. And in the quiet halls of their Amstetten home, those three things would soon define everything he became. After their wedding, Josef and Rosemarie settled into what seemed like a modest but stable life. They moved into his mother's old boarding house in Amstetten, a large, gray building that smelled faintly of metal and damp concrete. Maria, his mother, still lived upstairs, renting rooms to travelers and factory workers. Josef and Rosemarie took a small two-bedroom flat on the lower floor, and though it was cramped, the rent was cheap, and Josef liked the familiarity of his childhood walls. During the week, he worked in Linz, about an hour's drive away, spending long hours at a construction materials company. He came home only on weekends, always unannounced, always expecting things to be just as he left them. Rosemarie stayed behind in Amstetten, taking care of their growing family and his demanding mother. To outsiders, they looked like a hard-working, traditional couple, the strict but responsible engineer and his quiet, dutiful wife. But inside those walls, there was no warmth, only obedience, fear, and control. Their first child, Ulrika, was born in 1957. 2 years later came Rosemarie Jr., and then in 1963, their first son, Harold. Each new baby brought Rosemarie joy, but it also brought more work and more isolation. Josef rarely helped with the children, claiming he was too busy with his projects. He liked to remind her that everything they had, the roof, the money, the food, came from him, and that she owed him respect. In 1966, their fourth child, Elisabeth, was born. She was small and quiet, with pale blue eyes like her mother's. Josef appeared indifferent to her as a baby, but he paid attention in ways that made people uneasy. Silent, lingering looks, questions about where she slept, what she wore. Still, Rosemarie said nothing. In that house, no one questioned Josef. He was respected in the community and liked to project an image of precision and discipline. He walked to work in pressed shirts, carried his tools neatly packed in a leather bag, and spent his evenings tinkering with wiring and blueprints. But by 1967, the cracks in that image began to show. In October of that year, he had been watching a young nurse in Linz, following her for weeks, learning her schedule. When he discovered that her husband worked night shifts, Josef began to plan. One evening, he waited outside her apartment until the lights dimmed, then climbed through an open window. Inside, he found a knife in her kitchen, crept into her bedroom, and attacked her. The assault was violent, calculated, and carried out in silence. When it was over, he left through the same window, walking home as if nothing had happened. But the woman called the police immediately. Josef was arrested within days, and under questioning, he confessed. There was no remorse, no emotion, just an admission of fact. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison, but served only 12. And what was perhaps most disturbing was that his wife never questioned him. Rosemarie visited him regularly behind bars, bringing him food and clothes, telling friends that her husband had simply made a terrible mistake. The neighbors pitied her, calling her a good woman with a difficult husband. When Josef was released, his conviction was quietly buried under bureaucracy. Austria's criminal record laws at the time automatically erased old convictions after 15 years, so by the early 1980s there would be no trace of his crime on paper. He was free to start again, with no oversight, no warning label, and no suspicion. He returned to Amstetten, resumed his engineering job, and rebuilt his reputation. People saw a man who had learned from his past, a man dedicated to his family and his work. He kept his head down, fixed things, and volunteered to help with building projects in the neighborhood. He even told his new employer about his criminal record during the interview, but they hired him anyway. His skill and precision outweighed any moral concern. From that point on, Josef's life looked, from the outside, like a portrait of redemption. He built extensions on the family home, added a terrace, and talked about converting the basement into storage. But those who lived under his roof knew that nothing had truly changed. His temper still simmered just beneath the surface. He shouted often, and his punishments were unpredictable. The walls that once protected his family were now beginning to close in on them. And while the town saw a respectable man behind closed doors, his control deepened. It wasn't enough for Josef to have order. He wanted ownership of his house, his family, and eventually of another human life. As said earlier, Elisabeth Fritzl was born on April 8, 1966, the fourth child in a family that already lived under the quiet shadow of fear. From her earliest years, she was soft-spoken and careful, the kind of child who learned quickly that silence kept her safe. Her teachers described her as bright and observant, but distant, always glancing toward the clock, always eager to go home, as though she had somewhere else she needed to be, even when she didn't. Her father, Josef Fritzl, treated her differently from the others. At first, it was subtle. Longer looks, an unusual closeness, moments of attention that felt more like inspection than affection. But when Elisabeth entered adolescence, that attention turned invasive. Around the age of 11, Josef began crossing lines that no father ever should. It started with what he called teaching moments, a touch on the shoulder that lingered too long, a pat on the leg that made her freeze. She never spoke about it. No one in that house spoke about anything that might upset Josef. His temper was the boundary they all lived within. Rosemary, her mother, stayed busy with chores, pretending not to notice the shifts in his behavior. The older siblings kept their distance too, each of them conditioned by years of shouting and sudden punishment. By her teenage years, she began dreaming of escape. She wanted to see something beyond the small town of Amstetten, a world that wasn't ruled by fear. So, in January 1983, at 17, she made her first attempt. She ran away from home with a coworker she trusted from the restaurant where she had been training to be a waitress. They made it all the way to Vienna and found temporary work in a local bar. For the first time in her life, Elisabeth felt free. She laughed easily. She spoke to people without glancing over her shoulder, and she started to believe she might never have to see her father again. But that freedom lasted only 3 weeks. When the police found her during a routine ID check, they called her parents. Josef drove to Vienna himself to pick her up, pretending to be a worried father grateful that his daughter was safe. The officers handed her over, unaware of what she was really running from. When she got home, the door closed, and that brief taste of freedom disappeared. The police wrote her off as a rebellious teenager, another restless girl who had run away to the city. Josef made sure everyone saw it that way. He told neighbors and relatives that she was disobedient, ungrateful, and out of control. Inside the house, he punished her for embarrassing him. Years later, during interrogation, Elisabeth would recall what she had felt in those final days before he took her for good. "I thought maybe if I ran away, he'd forget about me," she said quietly. But he didn't. He never forgot anything. That attempt at escape convinced Josef that he needed to act. He believed his daughter was slipping out of his grasp, and to a man who thrived on control, that was intolerable. By the late 1970s, Josef Fritzl had started preparing for something no one around him could have imagined, a project that would exist outside the law, outside morality, and eventually outside daylight itself. In 1978, Josef approached Amstetten's city authorities with an idea that, at the time, sounded entirely reasonable. He said he wanted to build a nuclear fallout shelter beneath his house at 40 Ibstrasse, a reinforced cellar that could protect his family in case of a Cold War emergency. And in the late 1970s, that idea didn't raise suspicion. The world was tense, and the threat of nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was real, and Austrian law even encouraged homeowners to build private shelters. Josef submitted plans that looked legitimate: thick concrete walls, reinforced doors, an emergency generator, and a ventilation system. The city issued him the permits, unaware that what he was building went far beyond any safety design. Once he had official approval, Josef began digging. He worked alone, and he preferred it that way. He spent 6 years modifying the cellar, slowly transforming it into something that only he could understand. At first, it was a simple basement, then a workshop, then a labyrinth. He extended the walls, poured layers of concrete by hand, and installed pipes and wiring with surgical precision. He built 8 separate doors, each one more secure than the last, creating a path that led deeper underground with every turn. Behind one of those doors, he left a narrow passage barely a meter high, concealed behind a sliding bookcase. Crawling through it led into a hidden chamber, a room so deep and so isolated that no one outside could hear even a scream. Josef added soundproof panels, a small sink, a stove, and eventually a bed. He installed vents that connected to the main house, but disguised them behind fake walls. He did almost all of this at night. When his wife and children were asleep, he would slip into the cellar, carrying tools in cloth bags so they wouldn't clatter. He mixed concrete by hand, muffling the sound with old rags, and told anyone who asked that he was experimenting with new machinery for work. The truth was far darker. Josef was designing a prison. Every bolt, every pipe, every door had a purpose. He reinforced the ceilings with steel, sealed the walls against sound, and even built an emergency power switch that only he could operate. He created his own ventilation and water system, ensuring that no one, not even the people living upstairs, would hear or smell a trace of what was happening below. The cellar wasn't just a room, it was a trap engineered by someone who wanted total control over another human being. To the city, it was a fallout shelter. To Josef, it was a world entirely of his own making, a place where no one could question him, contradict him, or escape him. And by the time the final door was fitted, his plan was complete. He had built a home above ground for his family and a prison below for his daughter. By the summer of 1984, Elisabeth Fritzl was 18 years old and ready to start a new chapter of her life. She had finally secured a job offer in Linz, a city nearly an hour from Amstetten, and she was counting down the days to her move. To her, it felt like freedom, a quiet, ordinary kind of freedom, but one she had been waiting for all her life. She was packing her things when her father approached her with what sounded like a simple request. Josef told her he needed help fitting a door in the basement, one final task before she left for her new job. It wasn't unusual. He often worked on small home projects, and Elisabeth had helped him before. That afternoon, on August 28, 1984, she followed him down the narrow steps into the cellar, unaware that she was stepping into a place she would not leave for 24 years. The air downstairs was cool and thick with dust. Josef directed her to hold the heavy metal door in place while he adjusted its hinges. She steadied it, waiting for his signal. But as she stood there, she suddenly heard the door swing shut, a hollow clang that echoed through the small space. Then came the sting of something wet pressed against her mouth and nose. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was her father's hand holding an ether-soaked cloth against her face. When Elisabeth woke up, she was lying on a thin mattress in a cramped, windowless room. Her head throbbed, her wrists ached, and when she tried to move, she realized she couldn't. A metal chain was locked around her waist, fastened to a post, fixed into the concrete floor. The room was dimly lit by a small bulb. There were no windows, no clocks, no sense of time. Just the low ceiling, the smell of damp concrete, and the slow panic building in her chest. She screamed for hours. She shouted for her mother, for anyone who might be close enough to hear. But above her, the world continued as normal. Her family ate dinner, neighbors went about their routines, and not a single sound escaped the layers of concrete Josef had built around her. When he returned that night, she begged him to let her go. But Josef simply stood there, calm and collected, as if this was all inevitable. He told her that the doors were wired to release toxic gas if she ever tried to open them from the inside. Then he handed her a sheet of paper and told her to write a letter. In shaky handwriting, Elisabeth wrote the words he dictated: "I've joined a cult. Please don't look for me." When she finished, Josef took the letter, left the cellar, and drove nearly 100 miles away before mailing it to himself. A few days later, he brought it home and gave it to Rosemarie, pretending to be as shocked as she was. He showed it to the police, who accepted it as proof that Elisabeth had left willingly. The case was officially closed. Down below, Elisabeth realized what that meant. No one was looking for her. No one even knew she was missing. Josef began visiting the cellar every night. He brought food, bread, milk, canned soup, and supplies, but never comfort. He kept the lights on at his discretion, and when he spoke, it was to remind her who was in control. The fear was constant, and the silence between his visits was worse. Time began to dissolve. Days turned into nights, and nights into something endless. He told her this was temporary, that he would release her when she learned to behave. But Elisabeth had grown up in his house. She knew what his promises were worth. Each time she heard the sound of the locks above, she knew what was coming next. The cellar was no longer a project or an idea. It was now a reality, a private world that existed entirely beneath the surface, one that Josef ruled completely. And for Elisabeth, it had become the only world she knew. By 1988, 4 years into her captivity, Elisabeth gave birth to her first child. She named her Kerstin. There was no hospital, no doctor, and no help, only a thin mattress, a pair of blunt scissors, and a damp towel. Josef had provided her with an old 1960s childbirth manual and a bottle of disinfectant, as if that made the process civilized. The pain was unbearable, but Kerstin's first cry pierced through the basement like a reminder that life could still exist in this darkness. 2 years later, she had Stefan, and by 1992, another child, Lisa. But that time, Josef decided to change things. When Lisa was just a few months old, he carried her upstairs, wrapped in a blanket. A few hours later, the family found her on the doorstep in a cardboard box, along with a letter from Elisabeth. The note, dictated and forced, said she couldn't care for her child and was leaving her in her parents' care. Josef played the role of the bewildered father again, calling the police, expressing concern, and handing over the letter as proof. And it worked. Rosemarie and the authorities accepted the story, and Josef and Rosemarie were granted guardianship of Lisa without question. And soon, the same pattern followed. In 1994, another child, Monica, appeared on the doorstep. Again, there was a note. Again, no one doubted it. Each time, Josef staged the discovery carefully, at night, in winter, always with the same confused expression when social workers arrived. When social services asked how Elisabeth knew their new phone number, Rosemarie could only shrug and say, "She must be in a commune somewhere. We pray she's safe." It sounded plausible enough. Austria had seen stories of young people disappearing into spiritual groups or remote sects before, and since Josef was calm, polite, and always cooperative, no one pressed further. But below, the truth was unbearable. Elisabeth now had 3 children with her in the cellar, Kerstin, Stefan, and later Felix, who would be born much later in 2003. The room was stifling, with barely 600 square feet of space for 4 lives. He brought food, water, and sometimes small comforts, a few books, crayons, or a small television. He told her, "You can teach them. Keep them quiet." So she did. Elisabeth turned that underground prison into a classroom. She taught her children to read, to count, to sing softly. She played them stories on the radio, told them about the sun, and promised them that one day they would see it. But as the years went on, even she began to lose faith in that promise. Then came 1996, when she gave birth to twins, Alexander and Michael. The birth was the most difficult yet. The room was cold, and the babies were premature. And within hours, Michael began to struggle to breathe. Elisabeth panicked. She begged Josef to take him to a hospital, pleading that the baby wouldn't survive without help. Josef looked at her, emotionless, and said only, "What will be, will be." He never took the baby upstairs. For 3 days, Elisabeth held Michael in her arms, watching him fade, praying for a miracle that never came, and when the infant finally stopped breathing, Josef took the body away. The next time he came down, the air in the cellar smelled faintly of burned wood and chemicals. Later, investigators would confirm that he had cremated the remains in the house furnace. That moment changed everything. Elisabeth's hope, fragile and flickering, went out completely. She realized that she was not being punished temporarily. She was being erased, piece by piece from the world above. And so she stopped asking for help. She stopped counting the years and stopped believing that anyone would ever find her alive. Josef's world was divided. A quiet, normal household upstairs, filled with laughter from the children everyone thought were adopted, and a silent world below, where their mother and siblings lived in darkness, completely forgotten. He had built not just a prison, but an illusion, and for nearly 2 decades it worked. While the world above continued in silence, the world below was changing shape. By the late 1990s, the underground prison had expanded from its original 380 square feet to nearly 590 square feet. 2 small sleeping areas, a narrow corridor, a basic cooking space, and a toilet. Josef forced Elisabeth and her children to dig the walls by hand, passing buckets of dirt and rubble through the narrow passage he alone could unlock. The ceilings remained low, barely 6 feet high, so that even the growing children had to stoop when they walked. After 24 years underground, everything began to unravel because of one desperate decision and one dying girl. On April 19, 2008, Kirsten, Elisabeth's eldest daughter, suddenly collapsed. At 19, she was fragile and pale, her body weak from years without sunlight. Her skin had lost all trace of color, and her bones had grown brittle from severe vitamin D deficiency. That night, she began having seizures, her breathing shallow, her body trembling uncontrollably. Elisabeth tried everything she could, cold cloths, water, prayers, but nothing helped. She fell to her knees and begged her father to save her child. For hours, Josef refused. He had ignored similar pleas before, but this time Kirsten's condition was different. Her body was shutting down, and even he knew she wouldn't survive another day. Finally, and perhaps out of fear of losing control rather than compassion, Josef agreed. He opened the final door. Together, he and Elisabeth carried Kirsten up the narrow passageway. As Elisabeth stepped out, she saw daylight for the first time in 24 years. The brightness stung her eyes, and the air felt strange, sharp, and almost unreal. But there was no time to stop. They placed Kirsten in the car, and Josef locked Elisabeth back inside the cellar. At the Amstetten General Hospital, doctors immediately recognized that something was deeply wrong. Kirsten's skin was almost translucent, her veins visible through the surface. She was severely underweight, and her teeth were decayed beyond repair. The medical team searched for her file, but nothing came up. No birth record, no medical history, no school enrollment. When they asked Josef for basic information, the girl's mother, her background, her allergies, his answers didn't make sense. He hesitated, changed details, and grew defensive. At one point, he told them his daughter, Elisabeth, had joined a religious cult years ago and had left the child on his doorstep. The doctors exchanged glances. Something didn't fit. Josef's composure was rehearsed, but not consistent. And when they tried to contact the mother he described, no one could find her. They contacted the police. Soon, a public appeal aired on Austrian television. "Elisabeth, if you are out there, please come forward. Your daughter is gravely ill. We need your help." For the first time in 2 decades, Josef realized his control was slipping. The police were reopening a case he thought he had buried long ago. The next few days, he appeared anxious, pacing, muttering, and staying close to the basement. On April 26th, 1 week after Kirsten's hospital admission, Josef made his final move. He went down to the cellar and told Elisabeth to pack what she could. He said they were going to the hospital to help Kirsten, but his voice carried a warning edge. He brought Elisabeth and her 2 remaining underground children, Stefan and Felix, upstairs. Before they left, he looked at her and said, "Stick to the story, or you'll never see them again." It was the first time Elisabeth had been outside long enough to take in her surroundings, the same streets she had walked as a teenager, the same sky she used to dream beneath. But the moment wasn't freedom, it was fear. When they arrived at the hospital, police were already waiting. Doctors had alerted authorities that Josef's explanations didn't add up, and now the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Officers then separated Josef and Elisabeth for questioning. At first, she sat silently. Her hands shook, and she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Investigators thought she was in shock, perhaps even complicit in the neglect. But then she made a single request: "I'll tell you everything, if I never have to see him again." Once the officers agreed, she began to speak. For the next several hours, Elisabeth recounted everything: how he had lured her into the cellar, how he'd kept her there for 24 years, how she had raised 7 children in captivity, and how one of them had died in her arms. Her story was measured, detailed, and consistent. Too consistent to be anything but true. That same night, police arrested Josef Fritzl, then 73 years old. They took him from the hospital in handcuffs as news cameras began to gather outside. When investigators entered the Fritzl home, they followed the narrow path he had described, through corridors, behind bookshelves, past heavy steel doors, until they reached what one officer later called a house beneath a house. Inside that underground world, they found the remnants of lives that had been lived entirely in the shadows. Children's drawings pinned to damp walls, tiny clothes folded neatly beside an old crib, and a calendar frozen in time. After 24 years, the secret that Amstetten never saw had finally come to light. The truth that emerged after Josef Fritzl's arrest was almost beyond belief, yet every scientific test confirmed it. Within days, DNA analysis proved what Elisabeth had already said in her statement, that Josef was the father of all 6 surviving children, including those raised upstairs by his wife, Rosemarie. There were no other possible fathers. The evidence was absolute. When confronted with the results, Josef barely reacted. During his interrogation, he spoke calmly, even confidently, as if trying to explain a business decision rather than a crime. He told investigators, "I created a second life underground. They were happy there." He insisted that what happened between him and Elisabeth had been consensual, describing it as a private arrangement, a twisted rationalization that left detectives speechless. When asked about the infant, Michael, who was gone shortly after birth, Josef denied any wrongdoing. He claimed the child had been stillborn and that there was nothing he could have done. But the medical reports showed otherwise. The baby had suffered from a treatable respiratory condition, one that would have been survivable with even basic medical attention. As prosecutors gathered evidence, Elisabeth and her children were moved to a secure psychiatric hospital for rehabilitation. For months, doctors shielded them from the media, helping them adjust to sunlight and open spaces again. Elisabeth agreed to testify only through videotaped recordings, unable to face her father in person. The trial began in March 2009 at the Regional Court of St. Pölten, Austria. Journalists from around the world filled the seats, and security around the courthouse was intense. The proceedings were harrowing from the very start. Elisabeth's taped testimony ran for nearly 11 hours, played in 2-hour segments to the jury because the content was too disturbing to endure all at once. In the footage, she spoke quietly but clearly, recounting every year of her captivity, the fear, the manipulation, and the children she raised beneath the floor of their family home. Jurors were seen wiping away tears. Even seasoned court staff struggled to remain composed. Josef, sitting only a few meters away, kept his head down as the recording played, occasionally shaking his head as though denying what everyone already knew. His defense attorney tried to humanize him, insisting Josef was not a monster and pointing out that he had brought Christmas trees and toys to his family in the cellar. It was an argument that only deepened the public outrage. On March 19, 2009, 4 days into the trial, something in Josef's composure finally broke. He looked toward the courtroom, saw Elisabeth sitting there, disguised but present, and immediately turned pale. The next morning he asked to address the judge. He withdrew all previous denials and changed his plea to guilty on all charges. The courtroom fell silent as he admitted, for the first time, that he had destroyed the lives of his own family. The court sentenced Josef Fritzl to life imprisonment in a facility for the criminally insane, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. When the verdict was read, Elisabeth did not look at him. She had already turned away, toward the future that had been stolen from her for 24 years, but one she was finally free to reclaim. After the trial, Elisabeth and her 6 surviving children were given new identities, their pasts erased, their lives starting anew. They were relocated to a secure village, far from the prying eyes of the world that had once so casually dismissed their suffering. The only life they had known, locked away beneath a house in Amstetten, was now a part of their history that could never truly be escaped, but would no longer define them. They began long-term therapy at the Amstetten Mauer Clinic, a place where they could begin the difficult process of healing. Each child, in their own way, had to learn how to live outside the confines of those 4 walls. For some, it was the challenge of feeling the warmth of sunlight after years in darkness. For others, it was learning to trust again after being raised in fear and isolation. Elisabeth's own journey was just as grueling, but she had one purpose above all: to give her children the future they deserved. Rosemarie, Josef's wife and Elisabeth's mother, was unable to bear the weight of what had happened. She moved away, distancing herself from her daughter, unable to reconcile the woman she had married with the man who had hidden such horrors right beneath her roof. Years passed and the emotional wounds remained deep. However, Elisabeth, despite the unimaginable betrayal, found it in her heart to forgive her mother. The relationship, once fractured beyond repair, slowly began to mend, but it would never be the same. In 2013, the house that had held such dark secrets was sealed forever. The authorities filled it with concrete, burying the past within its walls, quite literally. Afterward, it was sold, a family's prison transformed into a place for new beginnings. As for Josef Fritzl, now known by the name Josef Meyerhoff, he remained in psychiatric custody, unable to hide from the consequences of his actions. His years of manipulation had twisted his mind, but the law had ensured that he would never again have access to the world he had once controlled. In 2021, a higher court ruled that Josef would remain confined indefinitely. No longer a man of influence, no longer a figure of authority in his own life, he would be isolated in a secure psychiatric facility for the rest of his days. His fate was sealed, but that of his victims remained in motion, their lives a testament to survival, resilience, and the power of hope. As Elisabeth's therapist once said, freedom was not the end of their story, it was the beginning of learning how to live again. For Elisabeth, her children, and for the world that watched in horror, their journey toward healing had only just begun. Now we'd like to hear from you. What do you think could have been done to prevent something like this? Was there a point in this horrifying story where someone could have stepped in and stopped Josef Fritzl before it was too late? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. We read every single one of them, and your perspective matters. And if this story moved you, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories just like this one. We bring you the facts, the stories, and the emotional depth you won't find anywhere else. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care of yourself, stay safe, and remember, some stories need to be told. Cheers.